Okay, let's unpack this. Ever wondered what really goes into figuring out if someone has, a learning disability?
Hmm.
It turns out it's way more complex and honestly far more fascinating than just looking at a test score.
Oh, absolutely.
We've been doing a deep dive into a stack of sources, articles, research papers, clinical guidelines, all focused on the psychological assessment and diagnosis of learning disabilities.
Right.
Our mission today is to cut through the complexity, sort of pull out the core principles and practices that guide experts in understanding an individual's unique learning profile.
Yeah, find the essence of it.
Get ready to see assessment in, well, a completely new light.
It really is about building a picture, isn't it? Piece by piece.
Exactly.
The sources make it clear this isn't some quick check. It's a comprehensive process
Mm.
aiming to understand the why behind the learning challenges.
The why, that's absolutely key. So let's start there. How do we even define learning disabilities from a psychological perspective? I was struck by the history the sources touched on, going back to the 60s.
Yes, it's a field that's, well, it's evolved significantly. Historically, people talked about things like minimal brain dysfunction.
Right, I saw that term, Samuel Kirk.
That's the one. Identifying conditions we now recognize as dyslexia or dyscalculia. But the big shift the sources highlight is moving beyond just describing the academic struggle,
Yeah.
the difficulty reading or doing math.
The surface level stuff.
Right, to understanding the underlying cognitive processes and the presumed neurological basis for those processes.
So it's not just seeing the symptom, like trouble reading, but trying to understand the root cause, the brain difference that makes certain learning tasks challenging.
Exactly. And the sources lay out several core psychological principles guiding this modern understanding. First, there's the neurodevelopmental nature.
Okay.
These aren't typically problems you acquire later in life. They're considered intrinsic, rooted in how the brain develops. They affect those cognitive processes essential for learning.
So not like a brain injury later on, usually.
Well, a brain injury can cause learning problems. That's an exception, the sources note. But what we're generally talking about here are these developmental conditions.
Okay, so something you're essentially born with, even if it doesn't become really obvious until school starts demanding those skills.
Precisely. And linked to that is persistence.
Persistence,
Mm.
meaning they don't just fade away.
Exactly. These aren't just temporary developmental lags. The difficulties tend to endure across the lifespan. But, and this is important, their manifestation can change.
How so?
Well, a young child might struggle with, say, sounding out words basic decoding. An adult with that same underlying issue might read accurately, but maybe incredibly slowly, with huge effort.
Ah, so it still impacts them just differently, maybe affecting their job or daily tasks.
Right. Which really highlights how the same core challenge can look different depending on age and the demands of the environment.
That makes sense. What about the idea of unexpected difficulty? The sources really seem to emphasize this one.
Yes, this is arguably the most defining characteristic. It means the academic skills are significantly, substantially below what you would expect given the individual's chronological age,
Okay.
their overall intellectual ability, and the quality of educational opportunities they've had.
So it's unexpected because
Because it's not primarily explained by other factors. Things like a global intellectual disability, or uncorrected vision or hearing problems, significant emotional issues, or, importantly, just poor teaching or lack of opportunity.
So it's this specific struggle that kind of stands out against a background of otherwise typical development or ability.
That's a good way to put it.
And this sounds like why a comprehensive assessment needs to look at both cognitive abilities and academic skills, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You need to understand their cognitive profile, their strengths and weaknesses in how they think and process information, and then you measure their actual academic performance. The gap, or maybe a specific pattern of weaknesses, especially when you've ruled out those other explanations, is key to identifying this unexpected difficulty.
And finally, the sources mention specificity. What's that about?
Yes. This principle highlights that learning disabilities typically affect a relatively narrow range of academic or cognitive functions, not, overall intelligence across the board.
So someone might have a significant struggle with reading due to dyslexia,
Right.
but they might be fantastic at math or art.
Exactly. That pattern of specific strengths alongside specific weaknesses is common, and it suggests selective differences in neurological pathways affecting certain skills, but not others.
Okay, so those principles define what we're looking for. Why is doing this detailed assessment so important then? What are the practical goals?
Well, it goes far beyond just assigning a label, though that's part of it. Identification and diagnosis are certainly goals determining if someone meets the criteria for, say, specific learning disorder with impairment in reading, moderate severity.
Right, getting the official diagnosis.
Yes, but the deeper purpose is really about understanding the individual.
Building that learning profile you mentioned earlier, that complete picture.
Exactly that. Identifying both the areas of challenge and, just as crucially, the areas of strength. How does this person learn best? What are their cognitive assets? What tools do they already have?
Okay.
And this profile is foundational because it directly informs eligibility for services and accommodations.
Ah, like in schools.
Yes, for instance, in the U.S., laws like the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, provide rights to special education services. The assessment data is required to see if someone qualifies.
So the assessment is proof, in a way.
It provides the evidence base.
Yeah.
And that can lead to important accommodations like extended time on tests, access to assistive technology like text-to-speech, or modified assignments.
So IDA is the key federal law ensuring kids with disabilities get support in U.S. schools. And the assessment helps figure out if they're eligible under that law. Makes sense.
Precisely. And perhaps most importantly, the assessment guides intervention and educational planning.
The roadmap you mentioned.
Exactly. The detailed profile provides that roadmap for educators, parents, and the individual themselves on how to best support learning. It's not just a diagnosis. It should be prescriptive. It should suggest specific strategies and approaches tailored to their unique profile, whether that's for school, work, or just daily life tasks.
That makes complete sense. It's about providing actionable steps, not just identifying the problem. Which brings us to the assessment process itself. Why isn't one test enough? Why go so deep?
The sources are really clear on this. LDs are complex. They're heterogeneous, meaning they appear differently in different people. There's just no single test that can capture all that complexity.
And legally.
Right. Legal mandates, like IDEA in the U.S., actually prohibit using only one test score to make the diagnosis.
Okay, that's important.
And beyond the legal side, learning itself is influenced by this complex interplay of cognitive, academic, socio-emotional, behavioral, and environmental factors. You have to gather information from multiple angles and then integrate it. The sources talk about using hybrid methods.
Hybrid methods, like pulling together different kinds of evidence. What does that actually look like in practice? What are the key components of a comprehensive evaluation?
Well, it really starts before any formal testing. It begins with a thorough review of records.
What kind of records?
Developmental history, medical records, past school reports, grades, teacher comments, results of any prior interventions tried, family history. All of it provides crucial context. It helps build a timeline, highlights patterns over time.
Getting the full backstory is essential then.
Absolutely essential. Then there are the clinical interviews. This is where you gather that rich qualitative data.
Talking to people.
Yes, you speak with the individual being assessed, of course, but also their parents or guardians and their current teachers or educators. You hear about their lived experience, the history of the difficulties from different perspectives.
How it actually affects them day to day.
Exactly. How the challenges show up in various settings, school, home, socially, and importantly, the impact on their daily life, their self-esteem, their overall well-being.
Hearing those real-world experiences must add so much depth beyond just test scores.
It really does. It humanizes the data. And alongside that are behavioral observations.
Watching them.
Yes. The clinician observes how the individual approaches tasks during the assessment itself. You look at their focus, their effort level, the problem-solving strategies they try, their frustration tolerance.
How they react when things get tough.
Right. And ideally, if possible, observing them in their natural environment, like a classroom, provides insights into their functional skills and behavior in context. You see if the behaviors in the clinic match what teachers are reporting.
So you're seeing how they function, not just their isolated performance on a specific test item.
Exactly. Then, of course, come the standardized measures that people often think of. The standardized cognitive assessments.
The IQ type test.
Well, they measure various cognitive abilities, not just IQ. They give quantitative data on underlying mental processes and standardized academic achievement assessments to objectively measure their current skill levels in reading, writing, and math.
Okay, these are the tests most people probably associate with learning disability evaluations.
They are crucial pieces, definitely. But as we've discussed, they aren't the whole picture. A comprehensive evaluation also looks at socio-emotional functioning.
Why is that so important?
Because there's a really high overlap, high comorbidity between LDs and conditions like anxiety, depression, or ADHD. The sources mention ADHD co-occurs in something like 31–45% of SLD cases.
Wow, that's high.
It is. So understanding this is vital for a holistic profile and for planning support. And finally, if it's available, reviewing response to intervention, RTI data is often important.
RTI, that's the school-based support system.
Yes, it's a multi-tier approach many schools use to identify struggling students early and provide targeted support. If a student hasn't responded well to high-quality instruction and evidence-based interventions within that RTI framework,
It suggests the problem might be more intrinsic.
it can be an indicator, yes. It suggests an intrinsic learning difficulty might be involved, rather than just lack of good teaching.
So, RTI data is another piece of the puzzle, showing whether lack of progress persists even with good teaching. It really sounds like you're gathering fundamentally different types of information, history, personal accounts, observations, objective scores, to build this layered understanding.
Precisely. It's all about triangulating the findings. Do the cognitive test results help explain the specific academic struggles described in the interview? Do the behavioral observations during testing align with the teacher's reports from the classroom? It's like detective work.
Okay, let's dive a bit deeper into those standardized tests then. The cognitive assessments, what are they really telling us beyond, say, an IQ score?
Right. Cognitive tests aim to unpack the cognitive profile, essentially understanding how someone thinks and processes information. They don't just give one overall score, they measure various specific mental processes involved in learning. Things like different types of memory, processing speed, verbal reasoning, visual spatial skills, fluid reasoning.
And the sources mentioned theoretical frameworks guiding this, like CHC theory. What's that?
Yes, the Kettlehorn-Carroll theory. It's a widely accepted model of cognitive abilities. It helps assessors think about intelligence not as one thing, but as composed of a general ability and several broad cognitive abilities.
Like the ones you just mentioned. Memory, reasoning.
Exactly. Fluid reasoning, GFFA, crystallized knowledge, GC, working memory, creatum, processing speed, and others. And these broad abilities are further broken down into narrow abilities. CHC provides a structure for understanding these different cognitive components.
So it helps pinpoint specific areas of strength or weakness.
Precisely. Beyond just a single IQ score. Widely used test batteries like the Wechsler scales, the WISCV for children, the WAIS for adults are structured around measuring several primary index scores like verbal comprehension, visual spatial, fluid reasoning, working memory, and processing speed.
And other tests.
The Woodcock-Johnson the Fifth Cognitive, WJ of the HECOG, is another major one, explicitly based on CHC theory, measuring a wide range of those broad and narrow abilities. There's also the Cognitive Assessment System, CAS, based on past theory planning, attention, simultaneous, and successive processing. Deficits in successive processing, for instance, are often linked to decoding difficulties in reading. And the EDI-PSY2 is more of a neuropsychological battery looking across domains like attention, executive function, language, memory, etc.
So different tools might be used depending on the specific questions being asked, and interpretation isn't just about the scores themselves.
Absolutely not. It's much more than just looking at the numbers. Assessors look for statistically significant differences between scores, both compared to the average person and within the individual's own profile. They perform pattern analysis. For example, in dyslexia, you might see a pattern of weaknesses in phonological awareness, rapid naming, and maybe working memory, alongside average or strong reasoning skills.
Finding that specific signature.
Exactly. And crucially, linking those identified cognitive weaknesses to the functional impact. How do they actually affect academics, work, or daily life activities?
Okay, so that's the cognitive piece. How does it connect to the academic achievement assessments? What's their primary role?
Their main purpose is to quantify the learning difficulties, to objectively evaluate proficiency in core academic skills like reading, writing, and math, and identify if there are significant deficits compared to peers of the same age or grade.
That substantially below idea again?
Yes. The sources often refer to skills being substantially and quantifiably below age expectations. Historically, comparing these academic scores to cognitive ability scores was a key way to identify that unexpected underachievement. While that discrepancy model has evolved, comparing cognitive potential and academic output is still part of the picture.
And what do these academic tests actually measure?
Well, standardized batteries like the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test, WIAT, often used alongside the Wechsler Cognitive Scales, or the Woodcock-Johnson the Fifth Achievement, WJIV-ACH, which is co-normed with the WJIV-COGYAG, measure specific skills within each major academic area.
Like?
For reading, it might include tasks assessing sounding out nonsense words, decoding, understanding passages, comprehension, and how quickly and accurately they read aloud, fluency. For written expression, it covers spelling, grammar, sentence construction, and essay composition. For math, it looks at calculation skills, math fluency, speed with basic facts, and applied problem solving. The Kaufman test of educational achievement, KTEA3, is another common one, covering similar areas and even including a specific dyslexia index.
Got it. And just like the cognitive tests, interpretation goes beyond the overall score.
Oh, definitely. The real insight comes from analyzing performance by domain. Is the issue primarily in reading, writing, or math? And then digging into the sub-skills within that domain. Is it a problem with basic decoding? Or is comprehension the main hurdle? Is it math calculation or applying concepts in word problems?
Drilling down.
Exactly. Identifying those normative deficits, where do they fall compared to their peers? Comparing academic performance with their cognitive abilities to see if that unexpected underachievement pattern exists. And crucially, performing qualitative error analysis.
Looking at the types of mistakes again.
Yes, this is so important. What kind of mistakes are they making? Are spelling errors phonetically plausible, suggesting they understand sound letter rules but struggle with exceptions? Or are they visually based or seemingly random? In math, are errors due to misaligning numbers, misunderstanding the concept, or calculation mistakes? This analysis can reveal the mechanism of the difficulty, the underlying processing issue, and link directly back to those cognitive findings.
That error analysis sounds incredibly insightful. It's like seeing how the brain is trying and where it's hitting roadblocks. Some sources also mention process data.
Yes, that's an emerging area, especially with the digital testing. Some platforms can capture how someone approaches a task, their response times, sequences of actions, self-corrections. Analyzing this process data might offer new insights into their problem-solving strategies and cognitive processes in the future.
Fascinating. Okay, so you have all these pieces, the cognitive profile, the academic performance breakdown, the interviews, the observations. How do you formally diagnose based on all this? What's the standard rule book people follow?
The primary framework used in many places, particularly North America, is the criteria outlined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, text revision, the DSM-5-TR for Specific Learning Disorder, SLD.
Okay, the DSM-5-TR.
Right. It consolidated previous separate categories like reading disorder, math disorder, etc., into one overarching diagnosis, SLD, with specifiers for the area of difficulty. It describes the specific characteristics that must be present for a diagnosis.
And what are those core criteria? Can you walk us through them?
Sure. There are 4 main criteria, labeled A through D. Criterion A requires persistent difficulties in learning and using academic skills in at least one of 6 specific areas, lasting for at least 6 months, despite receiving targeted help or interventions.
And those 6 areas are?
They are 1. Inaccurate or slow and effortful word reading. 2. Difficulty understanding the meaning of what is read, reading comprehension. 3. Difficulties with spelling. 4. Difficulties with written expression, grammar, punctuation, clarity, organization. 5. Difficulties mastering number sense, number facts, or calculation. And 6. Difficulties with mathematical reasoning, problem solving.
So the problem has to show up in one or more of those actual academic skill areas, and it has to be persistent even with help.
Exactly. Then, Criterion B states that the affected academic skills must be substantially and quantifiably below what's expected for the individual's chronological age.
There's that substantially below again.
Yes. And crucially, this difficulty must cause significant interference with academic achievement, occupational performance, or activities of daily living that require those skills. This is where those standardized test results, combined with clinical assessment and observations, are crucial to confirm the severity and the real-world impact.
So it has to be a genuinely significant problem, not just a minor struggle or dislike for a subject.
Correct. And the DSM emphasizes that this confirmation requires clinical synthesis. It's not just about hitting a specific score cutoff. Clinical judgment is really important here in integrating all the data to determine significant interference in the context of that individual's life.
Oh, okay. What's Criterion C?
Criterion C specifies that the learning difficulties must have their onset during the school-age years.
So they start when academic demands typically begin.
Right. Although the difficulties might not become fully manifest, they might not cause significant problems until the demands requiring those skills increase substantially, like moving to high school, college, or a demanding job. But the underlying vulnerability was there earlier.
Got it. And the final criterion, Criterion D.
This is the crucial exclusionary part. which is essential for differential diagnosis. Criterion D requires that the learning difficulties are not better explained by other conditions or circumstances.
Like what?
You must rule out intellectual disabilities, uncorrected visual or auditory acuity issues, other mental or neurological disorders, like ADHD affecting focus on tasks or anxiety, psychosocial adversity, like trauma or extreme poverty, lack of proficiency in the language of academic instruction, or simply inadequate educational instruction.
So you're basically making sure the specific learning problem isn't actually caused by one of these other major factors.
Precisely. It has to be an intrinsic difficulty with learning specific academic skills once these other explanations are ruled out as the primary cause.
Okay. And once those criteria A through D are met,
Then the diagnosis includes specifiers. You must specify which academic domains are impaired, with impairment in reading, written expression, or mathematics.
and those link to terms like dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia.
Yes. The DSM notes these are alternative terms often used to refer to these specific patterns of difficulties within the overall SLD diagnosis. So SLD with impairment in reading is often called dyslexia. SLD with impairment in written expression can align with dysgraphia, and SLD with impairment in mathematics with dyscalculia.
So it provides that extra level of detail.
Right. And you also specify the current severity, mild, moderate, or severe, based on the extent of the difficulties and the amount of support needed.
So it's a very specific diagnosis based on these clear criteria and patterns of struggle.
Right. And it's worth noting the sources mention other frameworks like the ICD-11, International Classification of Diseases, also have similar criteria for developmental learning disorder, showing there's global recognition of these conditions. But applying any criteria set effectively hinges heavily on that comprehensive clinical judgment needed to integrate all the developed information gathered during the assessment.
That makes perfect sense. And speaking of ruling things out, let's talk a bit more about that differential diagnosis. What else might look like an LD, and how do experts tell the difference? This seems critical.
Oh, it's absolutely critical for ensuring an accurate diagnosis and therefore getting the right kind of support. Many conditions can impact learning or look like an LD on the surface.
Like ADHD, you mentioned the high overlap.
Exactly. ADHD is probably the most common condition to consider. The challenge is distinguishing between difficulties primarily caused by pervasive inattention, hyperactivity, or impulsivity that disrupt learning across the board, versus a core difficulty processing specific academic information, like sounds and words or number concepts.
So someone with an LD might look inattentive.
Right. They might seem inattentive because the reading or math task is incredibly difficult and frustrating for them. But the primary problem isn't a deficit in attention regulation itself. It's in the academic skill processing. Of course, as we said, they can absolutely co-occur. You assess the criteria for both conditions, and if both are met, both can be diagnosed. That's comorbidity.
Okay, so one is more about focus and self-regulation, the other about processing specific academic content, though they often travel together. How about distinguishing SLD from intellectual disability, ID?
That's usually more clear-cut, although careful assessment is still needed. IDE involves global deficits, difficulties across both general intellectual functioning, typically indicated by an IQ score significantly below average, often around 70, 75 or lower, and deficits in adaptive behavior, meaning everyday practical, social, and conceptual skills.
So it affects most areas of functioning.
Yes. SLD, by contrast, is defined by that specificity we talked about. Difficulties in particular academic skills, despite having average or even above average overall cognitive abilities. It's that unexpected gap again.
So ID is a broader, more pervasive challenge affecting overall capacity, while SLD is a specific struggle within a profile that otherwise includes cognitive strengths.
That's a good summary. You also, of course, need to ensure the learning difficulties aren't primarily due to uncorrected sensory impairments.
Vision or hearing problems.
Right. Basic vision and hearing screenings are crucial first steps. If a significant sensory issue is found and corrected, you see if the learning difficulties resolve. If specific academic difficulties persist beyond what the corrected sensory issue could explain, then SLD might also be present as a co-occurring condition.
Makes sense. You have to make sure they can actually see the words or hear the instruction first.
Absolutely. And then there are emotional or behavioral disorders like anxiety or depression. These can definitely interfere with learning concentration and performance. Or, sometimes, they can be a secondary result of the chronic frustration and failure associated with an undiagnosed and untreated LD.
A vicious cycle, maybe.
It can be. The clinician needs to carefully untangle this relationship through history taking and looking at the pattern. Did the anxiety start before the reading problems became apparent? Or did significant anxiety emerge after years of struggling in school? Is the anxiety pervasive or mainly linked to academic tasks? It's often a complex, bidirectional interaction where each makes the other worse.
That sounds like it requires really careful investigation into the history and the specific pattern of difficulties over time.
It really does. And finally, it's essential, as per Criterion D, to rule out the possibility that the learning problems are primarily due to inadequate instruction or environmental disadvantage,
Like not having good teachers.
or missing a lot of school, frequent school changes, significant psychosocial stressors at home, lack of exposure to language or literacy. If a child hasn't had consistent access to quality, appropriate instruction in reading, for example, their difficulties might stem from lack of opportunity rather than an intrinsic disability. The assessment needs to review the educational history and context carefully to evaluate this.
So the whole differential diagnosis process confirms the problem isn't just caused by external factors or other conditions, but it's truly something internal to how that individual learns specific academic skills.
That's the goal. Although, again, it's important to remember that comorbidity is common. The assessment determines if the criteria for SLD are met even in the presence of other conditions like ADHD or anxiety, if those conditions don't fully explain the specific academic skill deficits.
Okay, wow. So you've gathered all this incredibly detailed data, cognitive, academic, interviews, observations, history you've carefully considered and ruled out alternative explanations. Now comes the really complex part, doesn't it? Synthesizing it all. How do you pull all these disparate pieces together into that meaningful, comprehensive learning profile?
This is absolutely where the real art and science of assessment comes together. It's about integration, weaving together all the threads, the cognitive findings, the academic data points, the rich qualitative information from interviews, the behavioral observations, the historical context, the socio-emotional factors into a coherent, understandable picture of the individual as a learner.
It sounds like constructing a complex narrative or story about that learner.
It really is, in a way. You're looking for converging evidence across all the different data sources and methods used. Does the pattern of performance on the academic test align with the behaviors observed during testing? Do both fit with the history described by the parents and the teacher's report?
Finding consistency across different information types.
Exactly. You identifying those characteristic patterns of strengths and weaknesses, that specificity hypothesis we discussed, to really understand the unique cognitive and academic landscape for this person. What are their assets? Where are the bottlenecks? This whole process leads to developing a case formulation.
A case formulation.
Yes, it's essentially the clinician's explanation, their hypothesis about why the learning difficulties exist and how they manifest for this specific individual. It integrates all the pieces into a dynamic understanding. The sources often recommend using an integrated report format to present this synthesis clearly.
So instead of just listing test scores in one section and interview notes in another, you're explicitly connecting the dots. Explaining how, say, a specific cognitive weakness in working memory might lead to that observed difficulty with multi-step math problems, which in turn might contribute to the anxiety reported in the interview.
Exactly. You show the interplay between these different factors. How a weakness in phonological processing connects to the specific types of reading errors seen on the test and the frustration observed when asked to read aloud. You also explicitly integrate the socio-emotional findings. Are there co-occurring conditions like anxiety or ADHD? How do they impact the learning difficulties? And how are they impacted by the learning difficulties? Interventions often need to address both.
That makes sense. You can't treat them in isolation.
No. And you also have to consider the influence of the environment. How do factors at home, at school, culturally, linguistically, either mediate the expression of the learning disability or potentially contribute to the challenges? Sometimes environmental factors can be the primary cause, which is why differential diagnosis is key, but they also interact with intrinsic difficulties.
So the final outcome isn't just a label, but this rich, highly individualized report.
Yes. A comprehensive assessment culminates in a report that clearly articulates the diagnosis, if the criteria are met. But more importantly, vividly describes the individual's unique learning profile, highlighting both their strengths and their weaknesses. And critically, it provides specific, evidence-based, actionable recommendations.
Actionable being the key word there.
Absolutely. These recommendations need to be tailored to the individual's specific profile, their unique needs and assets. They should offer concrete strategies that can be used at home, in the classroom, at work, in daily living. The report should be a practical tool for understanding and a blueprint for effective support.
It sounds like it's truly about empowering the learner and those who support them, not just labeling the problem. Finally, let's just briefly touch on the ethical considerations that underpin this whole complex process.
Yes, ethical practice is absolutely foundational in psychological assessment. The sources consistently highlight core principles derived from ethical codes, like beneficence, doing good, non-maleficence, avoiding harm, justice, fairness, and respect for people's rights and dignity. These guide every step.
And I imagine this becomes especially critical when assessing individuals from diverse backgrounds, cultural or linguistic differences.
Absolutely. Ensuring non-discriminatory assessment, particularly for individuals identified as culturally and linguistically diverse, CLD, is a major ethical and legal mandate. Guidelines strongly emphasize avoiding bias.
How do they do that?
Well, by adhering to rules like not using a single test score as the sole basis for decisions, employing assessment procedures that are validated for the population being tested and administered in a non-discriminatory way, and, crucially, conducting assessments in the individual's native language or primary mode of communication whenever feasible and appropriate.
So testing in Spanish if Spanish is their primary language.
For example, yes, best practices involve carefully assessing their language proficiency in both languages if they're bilingual, using culturally appropriate assessment tools, carefully considering background factors like acculturation level, quality of previous schooling, and socioeconomic background. And drawing information from multiple sources is key to differentiate between a genuine learning disorder and challenges related to language acquisition or cultural differences in experience.
So being really, really careful not to confuse a language difference with a learning disorder. That seems incredibly important.
It is paramount. Avoiding misdiagnoses, either over-identifying LDs and CLD populations or under-identifying them, requires significant cultural competence and careful methodology. Ethical practice also dictates how tests themselves are used, selecting measures that are technically sound, reliable, and valid for the purpose and the person. Adhering strictly to standardized administration procedures to ensure fairness. Interpreting results cautiously, always within the full context of all the other information gathered, and avoiding the temptation to overinterpret isolated scores or small differences.
And finally, how the findings are actually communicated back to the individual and their family.
Yes, this is perhaps one of the most crucial ethical steps. Findings must be communicated clearly using jargon-free, understandable language. The report and the feedback discussion should use respectful language, for example, using person-first language, child with dyslexia, or identity-first language, dyslexic individual, based on the preferences of the individual and community.
Being sensitive to how people identify.
Exactly. Communication needs to be culturally and emotionally sensitive. And ideally, it should involve a collaborative approach, ensuring the individual and their family understand the results, feel their perspectives have been heard, and feel empowered to ask questions and use the recommendations effectively.
It sounds like the assessor really acts as a guide in that final stage, helping the individual and family make sense of this complex profile and navigate the path forward.
That's precisely the goal, to provide clarity, understanding, and a practical path forward based on a deep, holistic understanding of the learner.
Wow. This deep dive has really, truly unveiled just how intricate, how nuanced, and how thoughtful the process of assessing learning disabilities really is. It's so much more than just administering a few tests. It's like this careful, evidence-based detective process, building a rich, complex picture of an individual learner.
It truly is about understanding the unique learning mechanism of that person, going way beyond scores to look at the patterns, the strengths alongside the weaknesses, and the dynamic interplay of cognitive, academic, emotional, and environmental factors. The sources powerfully underscored that this comprehensive assessment isn't an end in itself. Getting the label isn't the point. It's the essential foundation, the necessary first step for developing truly effective, individualized support that leverages their strengths while directly addressing their challenges.
And here's where it gets really interesting. We've seen how this detailed, multifaceted assessment process builds this incredibly nuanced picture of a unique learner, focusing on the how and why of their learning. So what does this all mean? It really means that understanding the mechanism of a learning difficulty is the key that unlocks the door to targeted, truly effective support. Now, consider this thought. With the rise of online learning platforms and digital assessments, they're collecting incredibly detailed data on how students approach problems, not just the answer, but the steps they take, the time they spend. Might the kind of process data analysis the sources touched on offer new ways to identify students at risk much earlier than ever before, maybe even before significant frustration takes hold? What new questions does this deep dive raise for you about how we can better understand and proactively support the diverse ways people learn right from the very start?